we're on sound. Laura, hold on one second.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We're going to get started in just a few moments and allow everyone a chance to log on.
Michelle, is this your slide or ours?
I have this slide up. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started, and I'll hand it over to our Executive Director, Laurent Hubert.
I guess that works. Thank you for joining us today on this hybrid event. For those of you who are online and those who are present on the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control as a human rights and development accelerator. First, I would like to remind everyone of some technical issues. The PowerPoint slides will be linked to the thank you email that will be available for all of those who have registered for this webinar. We encourage that you close other applications to increase your Zoom bandwidth and complete the survey when you after the webinar. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of the screen, and direct them to either a specific panelist, and we'll have some time for questions after the presentations. Before we start, I want to thank the governments of Panama and Ecuador for co-hosting this event. We'll try in a few minutes to see if the government of Ecuador wants to say a few words. In the meanwhile, I will invite my colleague Cassie Romero-Stoppi to read a statement from the First Lady of the government of Palau. And I want to recognize also Palau's leadership, not only during the negotiations of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, but also for leading the charge to get Target 3A in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which calls on countries to accelerate the implementation of the Fctc. Cassie, please read the statement from the Honorable Valerie Whips.
This is a statement from the Honorable First Lady Valerie Whips of the Republic of Palau. It's a congratulatory message for the Tobacco and Human Rights Side event on today, June 14th, 2022. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to express my warmest congratulations and thanks to the distinguished countries, groups, and organizations co-sponsoring this important side event on tobacco and human rights today. Palau's president, the Honorable Soren Gil Whips Jr. issued a proclamation declaring May 31st, 2022 as World No Tobacco Day in Palau. For the 25th year, the Republic of Palau joined the global community to observe this year's World No Tobacco Day, focusing on the toxic effect cigarette filters have on our oceans and exposing tobacco industry greenwashing of its carbon footprint from production, processing, to transporting tobacco. Palau is committed to the implementation of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, including SDG 3, good health and well-being, and specifically Target 3A, which aims to strengthen the implementation of the World Health Organization's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control in all countries as appropriate. In Palau, over 47% of our youth aged 13 to 15 years currently use any tobacco product. Recently, the use of e-cigarettes among our youth exploded and widely spread. Non-communicable diseases are the leading cause of death, illness, and disability in the Republic of Palau, and high rates of tobacco use is the one common risk factor in all of them. This side event is an invaluable opportunity to bring SDG 3A into focus and to the forefront of further dialogue between countries and organizations so that we can continue to work together in partnership, ensuring that goals of SDG Target 3A are met and implementation of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control continues. In closing, may you all have a very successful and fruitful gathering at this event, and I commend the countries of Ecuador and Panama for their co-sponsorship. I would also like to express my gratitude to ASH, Action on Smoking and Health, for their continuous work on tobacco control and their support to Palau and other countries and organizations. Once again, congratulations.
Thank you very much, Kelsey, and definitely thank you also to the Republic of Palau and to the First Lady, the Honorable Valerie Whips. I want to then introduce our next speaker who will join us virtually, Sarah Dalglish, the Executive Director of the Children in Law Policy 2030. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Laurent. I'm really pleased to be here today with this group, even if it is virtual. And I appreciate the introduction. It's an honor to speak at this important event and for an audience so engaged in the vital work of eliminating tobacco harms. I don't have to repeat for this audience that tobacco is one of the biggest public health threats the world has ever faced, killing more than 8 million people a year. And it's particularly encouraging to see an event that's focused on the human rights violations of tobacco. At Children in All Policies 2030, or CAP 2030, we view a rights-based approach as vital to reducing and eliminating the harms caused by tobacco, and in our work more broadly to ensure that children's needs are met in policymaking at all levels. Our work focuses on harmful commercial marketing to children and how this undermines their health and well-being around the world, whether by exposing children to dangerous products like tobacco or through marketing techniques that reinforce harmful stereotypes and, contribute to ever-increasing pressure on children and young people. And we do this by working with stakeholders at international agencies, in academia and civil society, and of course, with organizations representing children and young people to take a rights-based approach to protecting children from harmful commercial marketing. Tobacco and nicotine products are a prime example of commercial marketing reaching into children's lives to create lasting harms, including premature death for half of those who take up smoking. While many countries have outlawed, while many countries have outlawed marketing of these products to children, the reality is that most smokers start, as we know, before they are 18 years old. And the business model of tobacco companies relies on capturing people at an early age to create long-term customers. So it's really no surprise that tobacco marketing is pervasive in children's lives. One study of 5- and 6-year-old children, so very young children in Brazil, China, India, Nigeria, and Pakistan, found that 68% of them could identify at least one cigarette brand logo. And as recent studies have made increasingly clear, companies shift their marketing focus to target young people in jurisdictions with loose or less well-enforced regulation. But even where regulation of traditional tobacco and nicotine products is present, there has been a shift to the targeting of youth through colorfully marketed e-cigarettes and flavored vaping products, as we heard from Palau. In the United States, between 2011 and 2020, the use of e-cigarettes amongst high school students increased from 1.5% to 19.6%, according to a recent WHO report. 70% of 12 to 17-year-old e-cigarette users in the US say they use e-cigarettes because they come, quote, in flavors I like, flavors which can include mango, cupcake, gummy bears. Tobacco companies also exploit loopholes to market nicotine products on social media in posts viewed by millions of young people worldwide. So marketing, in addition to violating children's right to health, it violates children's rights to a safe and healthy start in life, and it perversely upends our universally held value that children require our support and protection as adults. And in too many cases, we allow these commercial interests selling a deadly product to be put before children's rights. So at CAP 2030, we consider this exposure to harmful marketing across all domains of products and practices and platforms to be part of the same problem. From cigarettes to ultra-processed food, gambling, and alcohol, and the targeting of children online and the use of their data, the rights and health of our next generation are being sacrificed for the profits of a few. As I mentioned, the CAP 2030 is working with the World Health Organization and many other stakeholders to develop a global program of action to eliminate marketing harms to children. And we're doing that by working on regulation at national and international levels, by increasing public awareness of this critical issue and providing a research basis to take strong, effective action. So this process already involves a wide range of civil society and advocacy partners, and we're eager to involve more. If you'd like to join us, please check out our website at cap-2030.org or by reaching out to me. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak at such an important event. Seeing the important work done by the stakeholders and co-sponsors here is really motivating for us. And I know that together we can make strides to protect children's health and their rights and make progress towards achieving the SDGs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Now we'd like to invite in our second speaker, which is, apologies, I needed to share again so you can see the presentation. And we go. So I'm going to present the next speakers with Marion Catelin, Director of the Alliance contre le tabac in France, who represent how the tobacco is infringing on women's rights in France. Marion, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laurent. And I'm also very pleased to be here to speak about this fact that big tobacco infringes women's rights. And I would like to present you how we use this leverage to try to denormalize smoking among women in France through a public awareness campaign. First of all, just a few words about my organization, Alliance contre le tabac. We are developing since 2020 a 4-year program to denormalize tobacco in France, and these through 9 public awareness campaigns. And through these campaigns, we want to renew the storytelling and the approach to make smoking prevention, and especially by highlighting the responsibility of the tobacco industry in the smoking pandemic instead of focusing on smokers one. And especially, we really want to show the unknown impact of the tobacco industry on the environment, but also, of course, on the human rights, and especially here on the women's rights. Just a few words. I cannot be so exhaustive, but I really want to explain you why big tobacco infringes, or how big tobacco infringes women's rights. The tobacco industry infringes especially their right to life and their right to health. On average, tobacco reduces the healthy life expectancy by 10 to 15 years. And also, tobacco prevents the fulfillment of the highest possible level of health, which is a constitutionally principle protected in France. And these fundamental rights are stated especially in the CEDAW, Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And also, of course, it is protected in the Fctc. Big tobacco also infringes their right to education. Globally, the tobacco industry exploits 1,300,000 children in the tobacco field, and this prevents also young girls to go to school. And this fundamental right is stated in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Also, big tobacco infringes their right to a healthy environment. We know that 64% of deaths related to secondhand smoke occur among women. And this is stated in the very recent resolution of the UN Human Rights Council, the 4813 from 2021, and in the French Charter for Environment too. And at last, big tobacco infringes the right to gender equality. And this is a key point for us, then you will see, to develop our public awareness campaign. Because we know that smoking among women is a very strong factor of social, health, and gender inequalities. And this infringes the goal number 5 for France to achieve gender equality and to empower all women through the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. Now, I would like also to explain you why denormalizing tobacco and smoking among women is so a necessity in France. Even if we have a very strong legislation in France, we have this fact that big tobaccos has made very strong targeting and through commercial marketing and targeting the women to make them smokers. And we have this very embedded cliche in the French society that cigarettes is seen as a symbol of women's emancipation. We have made last year a survey that showed that 43% of the French people considers that a woman who smokes is a free woman. And this has for a result a very alarming fact. 22% of French women are smoking in France on a daily basis, and 20,000 women are smoking each year from their smoking, and this is the double in 15 years. So now, how did we make to use big tobacco's women's rights infringement to denormalize smoking among women? We launched last year a campaign called Free Women. And the main goal of this campaign was to deconstruct the myth that a woman who smokes is a free and emancipated woman. And the secondary goal of this public awareness campaign was to enhance the information of the general public, and especially about the specificities of feminine addiction, and especially the higher risks to develop cardiovascular diseases. Our main target was the 18-35 years. And to develop this campaign, we really wanted to show that non-smoking is a way for more self-assertion and a sign of independency. And that's why in this campaign we use very positive terms referring to women's empowerment. And we had these two, the both claim, big tobacco never wanted a free woman, and this activation on social media, hashtag s'affirmer sans fumer, literally, assert yourself without tobacco. And to spread our messages, you will see we choose 2 female influencers to present their fight to assert themselves as women in our society without tobacco, freed from social constraints. Here, the bill of the campaign, and you can see our ambassador, Wendy Renard, who is the captain of the National Feminine Salsa team and very popular by our target. And I'll let you watch now our campaign spot, but I had to make a little move up.
Ils m'ont répété que si d'autres n'y étaient pas arrivés, alors pourquoi moi? Ça veut dire quoi? Femmes n'auraient pas les épaules pour ce genre de combat. J'ai pris le parti de faire mes propres choix et surtout de croire en moi. Je n'ai jamais commencé à fumer et je peux en être fière. L'industrie du tabac n'a jamais voulu d'une femme libre. Cette année encore, le cœur de 20 000 fumeuses s'arrêtera de battre.
I try to escape. Is this okay? Sorry.
Pourquoi les instances de protection de la
I
vie
press
privée
the
souhaitent
space.
interdire ce nouveau super
Sorry.
objectif? Ce nouveau gadget est en fait un super téléobjectif pour votre smartphone. Il s'agit d'un extraordinaire objectif zoom qui se fixe à votre téléphone pour vous.
Thank you. Sorry. Of course, also for this campaign, we led an advocacy campaign at international level in partnership with ASH and one of our member. We are trying to make a shadow report to the CEDAW committee previously in the French edition in 2033. And at the national level, we also met a few policymakers with key responsibilities in women's rights to defend our 3 recommendations. First, the more financing gender study to have a better understanding of the tobacco use among women and an efficient support in tobacco cessation. Second, we wanted also through this campaign to have more reinforced information so that the women knows that they have the possibility to have reimbursed consultations by a nutritionist, because we know that the fear of gaining weight because of social pressure on women is a major hurdle to quit smoking. And 3, we also wanted to have the implementation of the reimbursement of an allocated number of consultation with a psychologist for better care in smoking cessation. Very quickly on the evaluation of this campaign, we managed to have 500,000 views on social media, even if we didn't have so much budget to make sponsoring at the time. So that was encouraging. And we also had a very good media coverage with unusual media coverage like sports media that covered our campaign. And this is also part of the denormalization process. So that was very encouraging. We made also a survey to know a bit how efficient was our campaign, and more than 92% of respondents understood well the goal of the spot. 2 out of 3 of surveyed smokers said that the spot leads to reflect on their smoking, and also 1 out of 3 surveyed smokers said that the spot encourages to quit smoking. So in conclusion, we can say that this human rights and women's rights leverage is very interesting to denormalize tobacco, and that fosters our goal, the first tobacco-free generation by 2032. Thank you very much.
So we've heard how we heard about how marketing of tobacco products infringes on children's rights. You heard about how tobacco industry is impacting women's rights, and now the third presentation will address how the tobacco industry and its products can impact the rights of racial minorities. And Cassie Romeo's from ASH will be our next presenter.
Hello, everyone. I wanted to talk a little bit today about how we have started using the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination as a tool for health equity in the United States. So for those of you that don't know, the United States very rarely ratifies human rights treaties, but we have ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which unfortunately doesn't have a lot of room for tobacco control, and the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. We have not ratified the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So CERD offers an opportunity that we cannot use these other treaties for in the United States. In the United States, human rights is often not considered a huge priority. Sometimes people don't even understand what we're talking about when we talk about human rights, but social justice has really taken off as a concept and as a goal that we want to have achieved. So one thing that we're trying to highlight in this campaign is the intersection between social justice and human rights, and that achieving one helps us achieve the other. So I wanted to discuss how this all comes together in the United States. Menthol cigarettes, for those that don't know, in the United States have long been targeted advertised to African Americans. You can see from this mailing, that's clearly their target audience. They advertise at the point of sale in Black communities at a much higher rate than in white communities. They have advertised in magazines targeted to that community for decades. This has gone on. So obviously, African Americans smoke menthols at a much higher rate. 9 out of 10 African Americans that smoke menthol cigarettes. So this is a real racial issue in the United States. When the FDA banned flavors in cigarettes, they exempted menthol in 2009. It was the only flavor that was left out of the ban, and it was in large part due to advocacy from the tobacco industry. So recently, ASH and our partners at the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council sued the United States Food and Drug Administration for their inaction on menthol cigarettes. We are joined in our lawsuit by the American Medical Association and the National Medical Association. We asked the FDA to take action to ban menthol like they have with the rest of the flavors. After 1 year after our lawsuit, we got a response saying that the FDA was going to propose a rule. And just recently in April, another year later, we got the first draft of that rule. So it's exciting that this process is starting to come together, but unfortunately, it's very, very slow. The first draft of that rule is now open for comments. We encourage everyone to comment. You don't have to be American. You can get information from the ASH website, or we can share it after the webinar as well if you're interested in commenting. But part of that is that the rule has a few issues that we're concerned about. One is that they have yet to define characterizing flavor of menthol, which means there's a lot of loopholes for the industry to exploit. The second is the timeline. I mentioned the 60-day comment period that we're in now. The tobacco industry has already asked for an extension of that. They're probably going to get it. So we'll probably have comments until maybe September 1st. And then the FDA has to go back and read them all. They're legally obligated to look at them. So that will take some time. And then the FDA has to write a new rule, a new draft. And then at that point, the FDA has said it will take a year for it to take effect. That's assuming there's no litigation from the tobacco industry, which is a nice hope, but probably not reality. So part of the reason that we're continuing to look into international mechanisms is because the FDA process, while it's moving, is going to be very slow. This is the front page of our complaint. So the international component of this is that on the same day that the FDA rule came out, on the same day that the FDA announced they would propose a rule, we submitted a report to the International Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, asking them to please monitor the US's action on menthol. The timing was out of cycle, which we knew at the time. We wanted to make sure that the FDA knew that the eyes of the international community were on them, so we didn't mind so much that it was out of cycle. But now this has taken so long that we're actually in cycle. So the United States is up for review, which only happens once every 5 years, in front of this committee this August. So we have reopened our report. We have edited it to add sections about the concerns I mentioned on characterizing flavors in the timeline. And we're hoping to resubmit this report to the committee by July 15th this year, and to go in front of the committee in August and ask for them to maintain pressure on the United States government until this rule is in place. There's a sign-on link at the end of our PowerPoint presentation, but we encourage organizations in all countries to please sign on to this report. It's very important and it protects the lives of vulnerable people in the United States. I also wanted to mention that ASH maintains Tobacco and Human Rights Hub, where we have resources on all of these topics. So please feel free to check that out. And that's it for me. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Kelsey. And our next speaker is Sabina Timko-Yakatsi with the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control Secretariat. Sabina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Laurent. And it's a pleasure to be here equally among peers who are concerned about this issue. So I will give you a small insight into how the convention relates to human rights, both in practical terms and seen from a legal perspective. So first, if we take a step back, Sarah mentioned this in the beginning, but yes, indeed, tobacco is a threat, and it is absolutely an issue of human rights because it takes more than 8 million lives each year. And while 7 million lives are lost due to tobacco consumption, actually 1.2 million are due to exposure to tobacco smoke. So these are people who have never made a conscious choice to smoke. And this number includes children who are most vulnerable and less able to protect themselves and also the most exposed. So tobacco does pose a threat to health, it does pose a threat to life and to well-being, not only of humans, but also of the planet. So this year, we are really trying to emphasize also the a less known side of the tobacco harms, which is related to the adverse impacts on the environment. And also today, the right to a healthy and safe environment is well recognized as being one right that is part of the bigger family of human rights. So it's important to recognize that. The vulnerability, yes, that is a very important issue to consider when we speak about human rights. Because several segments of the of society across regions, across years, are consistently targeted by the tobacco industry. These are the children, the youth. We have heard also in the presentation that women are very much exposed. So gender norms are absolutely exploited by the tobacco industry, but also indigenous populations. And we know today, given the evidence that is being collected, that the poor countries are carrying the heaviest burden of the tobacco epidemic. And the modest households, the tobacco consumers, the tobacco growers, they are, and their families, they're very much vulnerable in the face of the tobacco threat. And of course, these vulnerabilities, they have been exacerbated in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, as countries had to reallocate their resources to address the sanitary crisis due to the COVID-19. So of course, not only tobacco control in general took a hit, but the vulnerable groups were also next in line. So how does the convention communicate with human rights? We don't need to look very far. Actually, in the foreword itself, it is clarified, and we're not shy about repeating this at every occasion that we have, that the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control is an evidence-based treaty that reaffirms the right of all people to the highest standard of health. The convention also recognizes its peer international human rights instruments. So that's very important, because it does call on parties to synergize with obligations that they have under other human rights instruments. And then the WHO Fctc objective is also very clearly articulated that the convention is meant to protect present and future generations from the devastating health, social, environmental, and economic consequences of tobacco consumption and exposure to tobacco smoke. So of course, these consequences in human rights language, they are known as adverse impacts on human rights, and implementing the convention is effectively a way to remove barriers to promoting and to achieving human rights. I will not go through all the provisions of the convention, of course, in detail, and perhaps it wouldn't be, in any case, it wouldn't be an exhaustive exercise. But the idea is that even though the convention itself does not mention explicitly human rights, the different provisions, they do communicate clearly. So from core measures that are meant to protect minors, that are meant to reduce the demand in tobacco products, or to reduce the supply in tobacco products, these all can be traced to instruments and to obligations to protect the right to life, the right to health, to increase access to information about the harms of tobacco, the right to education, both in terms of understanding more about the risks of tobacco consumption and exposure to tobacco smoke, but also in terms of unlocking the barriers to the right of education. For instance, if we look at issues such as child labor. So the right to safe working conditions, as I mentioned, to a healthy environment, and of course we have a very important provision to support the transition to sustainable livelihoods. The convention also is recognizing the specific vulnerabilities of the groups that I mentioned before. So it does call for protection of children, of minors. It does call for gender sensible tobacco control measures, for the protection and inclusion of indigenous peoples in developing and implementing tobacco control. And it does, of course, recognize a tobacco-related disability. Now, I don't want to make a legalistic presentation, but it's just to say that it's not only the convention that communicates to human rights, but also the human rights world within the UN and beyond is looking at the convention. And that's very positive, and it's very encouraging, because we are trying consistently to break the silos and to move beyond the tobacco control community, beyond the health community, who's already very aware of the harms of tobacco, and to bring this into a wider fora. So the guardians, the committees of the UN human rights treaty bodies that are recognized by the convention, they also refer back to the convention in their general comments, in their country reports. We are very fortunate to have been able to share experiences around Article 5.3 of the convention on the absolute need to preserve health measures, but also public interest in general from the interference by the tobacco industry, which is still the biggest barrier to the implementation of the convention today. And then the UN special procedures, they also do refer to tobacco control, in particular the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health. So we're very happy that this topic is taken up. And of course, if we are here today, it's also on the margin of the HRC as well, where the dialogue between the SDGs and the human rights is well recognized. And as it has been mentioned before, the convention is part of parcel of the SDGs. We know that just as human rights are indivisible, the SDGs cannot be picked on a menu, and they need to be seen as a holistic agenda. Again, very quickly, without going into details, I did want to mention that the Conference of the Parties, which is the governing body of the convention, is not oblivious to this topic. And we have had a number of decisions. I didn't mention all of them, but as of COP7, human rights have been recognized as an important element and prism for which we need to look at tobacco control. We have had a dedicated decision at COP7. And then in the implementation guidelines of the convention, which are adopted unanimously by parties based on consensus. We can find very strong references as to how certain articles, like Article 8 on the protection against tobacco smoke, and Article 12 on education and communication, that these obligations are grounded in fundamental human rights and freedoms. Also, human rights harms due to tobacco harms are recognized in the global strategy, and we do expect to have a discussion on this issue at the next COP10, which will convene in November of next year in Panama. So we do expect to have a discussion amongst parties and potentially a decision in this regard as well. So this is my last slide. I'm conscious of time, but if we need to retain certain messages, is that the WHO reaffirms the right of all people to the highest attainable standard of health, and I underlined all because that's very important. In the leave no one behind concept within the SDGs attainment, the tobacco control measures, they have to protect minors, they have to be gender sensitive, they have to be inclusive, and they have to enable sustainable development. The convention is integrated within the DNA of the SDGs, so it cannot be taken apart. And then a comprehensive implementation of the convention is absolutely a tool to both promote and achieve human rights and the SDGs. Thank you very much. Back to you, Laurent. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabine, for making that link between the synergy between the FCTC and human rights processes. And indeed, this is really the FCTC can really be an accelerator, and it's already has been a very interesting and useful document that was developed by UNDP a few years ago. The FCTC is an accelerator towards the SDGs, and clearly also can be an amazing tool to achieve human rights goals and objectives. And you already mentioned, so Sabina just mentioned already that the human rights are integrated in the FCTC and some of the guidelines, particularly, for example, Article 8 guidelines are grounded on human rights and the right to health. But also, it's not the first time that, and even within the human rights world, tobacco has already been recognized as an issue. So, for example, General Comment 14, which is developed by the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, established already in 2000 that basically within that document, which is basically authoritative interpretation of the article that addresses the right to the highest attainable standard of health, within it, it discourages the use of tobacco, and under the violations to protect, so the obligation to protect, it mentions as a violation for failure to protect the citizens of a given country, the failure to discourage the production, marketing, and consumption of tobacco. So this is already to demonstrate that the human rights bodies have already recognized tobacco as an issue. Same with the Committee on the Rights of the Child. In 2013, when it adopted General Comment 15, which is General Comment on the right to the child, to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health, it also calls on member states and countries to introduce international law, implement and enforce international agreed standards concerning children's right to health, including, among others, the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. So, as you can see, we start to see a body of evidence within the human rights bodies. Similarly, the Human Rights Council in 2017 adopted Resolution 3523 on the right to the highest standard of health and the SDGs. And in that resolution, and urges every state to work towards the full implementation of the health targets in the SDGs, including obviously Target 3A. So it's not something totally new to make the link between tobacco and human rights. Clearly, it's already, we're building already on the body of precedent, so to speak. And also a few years ago, some of you may have heard of Philip Morris International had entered into a relationship with the Danish Institute for Human Rights. And at the end of this relationship, this institution, which is a quasi-governmental institution, they determined the conclusion was actually quite strong, that there can be no doubt that the production and the marketing of tobacco is irreconcilable with the human right to health. And they even went further. They even went as far as stating that for the tobacco industry, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights therefore require the cessation and production and marketing of tobacco. So really recognizing that, that tobacco is an obstacle to the right to health. And as was mentioned others earlier, I mean, as you heard from the previous presentations, there's a number of rights that have been impacted: women's rights, children's rights, racial minorities, the right to healthy environments, for example, that right which has been recognized just last October formally through Resolution 8413. The fact that, for example, tobacco is responsible for 5% of global deforestation has an impact on the right to healthy environment. But it's also right to information. For example, in the United States, the tobacco industry has blocked health warnings, pictorial warnings on packages of cigarettes, and so on and so forth. So it's something that we see, unfortunately, that violation of rights or that obstacle to rights come up time and again. Then also the UN Global Compact Act in 2017 excluded tobacco because of it goes during direct contact with the SDGs, particularly goal 3, which is the health goal in the SDGs. And civil society has become quite behind this. For example, so the last World Conference on Tobacco Health that took place in South Africa, there was a statement that was adopted by the World Conference and then was sent actually to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, basically recognizing that tobacco is an obstacle to the right to health. And this statement was also signed by hundreds of NGOs around the world. And the previous speaker, Sabina, mentioned the decision, the human rights decision. And this is something that we, from the view of civil society, think it's an important, could be an important decision, because we really see the Fctc as an accelerator towards achieving, and it's a best practice tool to achieve not only health objectives, but also tobacco control objectives, but also to achieve the development as well as human rights objectives. We see it as a tool that can really help take the world one step closer towards a more equitable and healthier and a more righteous environment. And I found this was interesting in the context of how can we use and how should the Human Rights Council address tobacco issues. And there was an article published in the Health and Human Rights Journal 2 years ago, over 2 years ago. And I really like the conclusion, because they basically conclude that human rights can provide a unifying framework for global health governance. I think the things that have come out from the Human Rights Council and avoiding the silos within governments, and to make sure that various segments of society, whether it's not only health ministries, but trade ministries, finance ministries, and so on, and all of them work together to help achieve the SDGs, the objectives associated with Target 3A and Target 3.4, which is also a reduction of NCDs, as well as all the other ones which are also impacted by tobacco. So I'll leave it at that to allow time for Q&A. I know we have stop the sharing of this slide. Stop sharing the. Stop share. Here we go. Much better. See some text. So I was wondering if there's any questions. If you have, I don't see any questions on the Q&A. But maybe I will ask. So Sarah, you're still online, Sarah?
Yes, I am.
Yes. So what would be your in the work that you do, for example, with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, for example, and on next steps? And I know you were even discussing the idea of this optional protocol, for example, on marketing to children. But what would you see? What would be your recommendations as next steps to make that connection and strengthening, and how to make that link between using tobacco control strategies and the implementation of the Fctc to protect children's rights?
Yeah, thank you. So I think that it's a really good question, and one that I wouldn't venture to give a definitive answer on, because as I mentioned, we're working with a large group of stakeholders at different agencies, with civil society, with children and youth groups. And I think that we're studying the terrain very quickly because, you know, there's a number of different possibilities to be explored in terms of which articles to use as the basis of support, in terms of whether an optional protocol is the best way forward, a general comment. I think basically we're studying it carefully to make sure that we make the right decisions. And indeed, we also want to highlight the importance of work at country level, because as we know, it's critical to have the support of countries in international forums, and also to learn from the regulations that they put forward. So that's why we're proceeding along both the tracks of international regulation and national regulation. And I think those are processes that will be playing out. I think there's a lot of amazing expertise on this panel, and I'm sure within the attendees as well. And that's why we're inviting anyone who's interested in being involved. So it's kind of a non-answer to your question, but I think it's because we want to be careful to go about it in the right way, and to make sure that it's a process that involves lots of different stakeholders, because it's the more people who are involved, the stronger the coalition will be.
Thank you, Sarah. And my next question is going to be for Marion Catalan. This week, the CEDA is actually in session. And we asked, so there's this campaign in France around the France's reporting obligations to CEDA. If you maybe come here, and what would be your expectations? What would you like the committee, the CEDA committee, to recommend to France?
Yes, thank you, Laurent. Yes, to us, this way to make advocacy through international institutions is very important, because we expect that the CEDA committee ask the French government to take positions and to make recommendations also to the French government to go further in tobacco control in France, and especially to fight against smoking among women. So, yeah.
Something absolutely critical, given the more than 20,000 women die in France because of smoking, and that increase of smoking amongst women in France. Then a question for Sabina with the Secretariat. Given that, so for example, within the Human Rights Council, which is in session now for the next few weeks, what should civil society do to strengthen the message, or really make that message that the Fctc is a best practice tool really for governments to achieve a number of obligations that they have already under other treaties, but also to achieve their the commitments they've made under the SDGs and human rights treaties? What should we do as civil society, and what should the Human Rights Council do?
Thank you very much, Laurent. And I think that the answer was also partly in your presentation. I mean, we do rely very much on our NGO observers. So we have a network of civil society representatives that are supporting the implementation of the convention. And I believe that one of the areas is really to raise the visibility of the convention amongst our peers at the UN that work on human rights. And as you correctly mentioned, we do not start from scratch. We already have the foundation, so we shouldn't be shy about it. I think that a lot of the issues that were mentioned today in terms of how to improve the take-up and the protection of women's rights, for instance, they find the answer in tools that exist for a very long time at the, within the convention. Even if it's the implementation guidelines, we do have reports that look at how gender norms were successfully used by the tobacco industry to promote their products towards women and girls. But gender norms, but gender is not sufficiently integrated in the tobacco control responses. So for instance, shedding light on how these groups are targeted by the industry and the tools that are available actually to counter the industry would be very important. Another important issue for us is to still spread the message of how irreconcilable, as you said, it is that basically the tobacco interest and engagement cannot be compatible with human rights, cannot be compatible with what is called corporate social responsibility, that actually the COP has defined this as marketing by the tobacco industry. And as such, it should be banned or at the very least regulated while waiting to be banned. So I think that that's the main message, is to already make known the tools that we have available within the convention.
Thank you for this, Sabine. And clearly, we do need to raise more awareness about the Fctc, even in the French context, for example, where the tobacco industry is using environmental, for example, approaches to try to use to basically do greenwashing and use it as a corporate social responsibility strategy. And then at the same time, within parliamentarians in France, unfortunately, a lot of them are aware of environmental treaties, but they're not aware about the Fctc, even though France has ratified and is trying to implement it as well as it can. So we still have some work to do to raise awareness. And you raised a very important point about what if a country, for example, makes overall progress and we see a decrease in prevalence, decrease in prevalence, but it's actually increasing among women. And that could be quite problematic. And one of the problems, I think, is we do not disaggregate data in many countries to see whether we're making progress among all groups. That's my next question is for you, Kelsey. In the United States, for example, we've seen a big decrease in smoking within the general population, but that has not been across all populations. So the poor, some racial groups and others have not seen those same rates of decrease in the United States. And I know that's also the case in Australia, for example, where Aboriginal populations maintain some very high rates of smoking. So what would be in this case your recommendations in the context of the third review for the United States in front of the third committee, but also for other countries which experience that problem?
So I think that the human rights mechanisms are an important tool for us to help achieve health equity, because as you mentioned, a lot of places, certain groups are left out of cessation support or things like that. Part of the FDA comment, something we're asking for is culturally competent cessation support, because even if there is cessation support, it isn't always targeted to the communities that need it. You mentioned racial minorities, and we've discussed women. The LGBT community is also heavily targeted by the tobacco industry and not supported as frequently. So I think that using a human rights mechanism to do this is a great way to help connect the Fctc with these other vulnerable populations and solve some of these problems.
So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. As was mentioned today, the link has already been made between the impact that tobacco has on development and human rights. We have the tools. We have the Fctc as a tool that can really help address that problem. What we need to do is accelerate its implementation across the world, and doing so will really help us progress towards the SDGs, human rights objectives and so on and so forth, including the right to a healthy environment, not just health. If you're interested, please stay tuned for other webinars that will take place. And we have tools for advocates interesting on the topic of health and human rights and tobacco and human rights. And you can get more information by going to the hub, which is at ash.org. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us today. And stay tuned. And for those of you who are attending the Human Rights Council session this week, good luck and help us basically integrate tobacco within the Human Rights Council work. Thank you very much.